Okay, so this is part 2 of chapter 6. We're going to talk about food sources of triglycerides. Most of the food that we eat provides some level of triglycerides. Some foods, such as animal fats and vegetable oils, are mostly triglycerides or very high in triglycerides. Fruits and vegetables tend to be lower in triglycerides, except for coconuts, which are high, as well as avocados. And so I'm going to move myself over here. And let's talk about table 6.1, main sources of fatty acids and their state at room temperature, which tells us, again, if they're saturated or unsaturated. So let's take a look at some saturated fats. And so, again, we're going to talk about this further, but for now, you should know that saturated fats tend to increase the levels of LDL cholesterol in our blood. And so again, LDL, you can think of its low density lipoprotein. We'll talk about what exactly that is a little bit later in the chapter, but for now, this is what we label kind of our bad cholesterol. We don't want these levels to be high. And so we have long chain saturated fatty acids, and those include things like lard, fat and beef, pork, and lamb. So again, animal products here. These are going to be saturated fats that are solid at room temperature. Okay. And then we have medium and short chain fatty acids, and this is a little bit nuanced. So what's included here, medium chain fatty acids are things like milk fat from butter, and then medium and short chain fatty acids from things like coconut oil, palm oil, and palm oil. And so these types of fats tend to be softer, and some of them, like palm and palm kernel oil, tend to be liquid at room temperature. And so, are these good for you or not good for you? Again, it's pretty nuanced. So like coconut oil, for example, you can get coconut oil that is liquid at room temperature or kind of a soft semi-solid. So coconut oil does have saturated fats. Again, they tend to be medium and short chain fatty acids. They do raise blood LDL levels. Coconut oil has also been shown, as other medium and short chain fatty acids as well, have been shown to also raise good cholesterol levels, so HDL levels. So again, it's kind of nuanced, but in general, coconut oil is a saturated fat. It does tend to raise bad cholesterol levels more than good cholesterol levels. So, it's a fat that should be consumed in limited amounts. Okay? Not never. But again, there are healthier choices. For example, if we go down one, monounsaturated fatty acids, these have been scientifically shown to decrease levels of bad cholesterol, so LDL. Okay, and again, they are monounsaturated, which means that there's one double bond in the fatty acid chain. And so main sources are things like olive oil, very healthy oil, canola oil, which is a seed oil, and then peanut oil. Okay, again, healthy, vegetable oils, healthy oils, monounsaturated. Again, they are going to be liquid at room temperature. You don't want to have hydrogenated, oils. Hydrogenated oils behave more like saturated fats. So it's nuanced. We have to be very careful, and read labels. So if you're eating a processed food that has some type of vegetable oil in it, but it says in front of it hydrogenated vegetable oil, well, that's not a good choice. So again, it's very nuanced, confusing for the consumer for sure. So we got saturated fats, which raise bad cholesterol, monounsaturated fats that decrease bad cholesterol, and then polyunsaturated fats, which also decrease LDL, bad cholesterol levels. And so polyunsaturated, there are 2 or more double bonds in the molecule. So sunflower oil, corn oil, safflower oil, fish oil. Again, sunflower, corn, safflower, those are all considered to be seed oils. These are liquid at room temperature. Okay? And again, in the liquid form, in the non-processed form, they have been shown to, again, decrease bad cholesterol levels. In the processed form, they're not great. They behave like saturated fats. Omega 3 and omega-6, right? These are our essential fatty acids that we've talked about. Again, we talked about omega-3 being found in cold water fish, fatty fish like salmon, sardines, mackerel, great sources. We can also find some forms of omega-3s in walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, which are my favorites. And then we have omega-6s, which can be found in a variety of sources. So beef, chicken, eggs, safflower, sunflower oil, corn oil. Okay. Some of these are solids, some are liquids. And then we have naturally occurring trans fats. And again, naturally occurring trans fats are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's important to tell you. It's only trans fats that are formed through partial hydrogenation that are bad. And again, those have been banned. Those would be found in ultra-processed foods. So we find naturally occurring trans fats in milk and dairy products. Okay. Okay. So here is another table that shows food sources. So it's really the same thing as that last table. It breaks it down into saturated fats, monounsaturated fats. So again, one double bond, and then polyunsaturated fats, 2 or more double bonds. And so again, just some more examples, some saturated fats. Again, coconut oil goes up here. Again, coconut oil is made up of medium chain. It's a medium chain fatty acid, not a long chain fatty acid. And so it does rise LDL, but it also raises HDL. So again, it's nuanced. Okay. Butter, palm oil, lard or beef, stick margarine, shortening. These are all forms of saturated fats, which again, should be consumed at relatively low levels. And I'll actually give you levels in a little bit. Monounsaturated fats, olive oil, canola oil, peanut oil. Again, better choice. So unsaturated is better than saturated. And then we have PUFAs, polyunsaturated. So safflower, sunflower, corn oil, soybean oil, type of margarine. It's kind of funny that margarine is there, nuanced. It depends on the ingredients. It depends on the brand. Sometimes you can get non-hydrogenated, especially if it's a soft margarine. So again, we put it in this category of a PUFA, but it depends on the brand. So you really have to read labels. Okay. Some other sources of fat. So I just want to kind of make this point that some fat is visible, right? You know you're eating it. So butter on toast, oil in a bottle, mayonnaise in potato salad. You can see it marbling in red meat. I showed you that picture of bacon. You can see the white, strips going through it. It's very easy to see some fat. We call that visible fat. And then in other situations, it's hidden. So for example, in ultra-processed foods, right? You don't see the fat. You have to look at the label. So you got to read nutrition facts labels, and we've kind of learned how to do that. So hopefully you can do that. You don't see fat in whole milk. You're not seeing the fat in cheese, right? Whole milk and fat-free milk look the same. So you can't actually see the fat. The same thing with cheese. Full fat cheese and low fat cheese look the same. Ultra-processed food, you're not seeing the fat. Hot dogs. So hot dogs would be considered to be an ultra-processed food. So here we have Wiley's Wieners over here. I wanted to point this out. So these have, hopefully you can see this, they have 140 total calories in one hot dog. Okay, it's 45 grams of this food. And if we look down at fat, I know this is small, I need my readers. It says 13 grams of total fat, saturated is 5, trans is 0, okay, so on and so forth. Look at the sodium, 420 milligrams, that's pretty high. It does have some carbs and a little bit of protein in here as well. But let's look at fat content. Okay, so again, it's 140 calories total in one hot dog. In one hot dog, there are 13 grams of fat. Okay, we know that for every gram of fat, we have 9 kilocalories of energy. And so I want to calculate how many calories are there from fat. And so I would take my 13 grams of fat, multiply that by my 9 calories per gram, and 117 of the 140 calories in this hot dog are from fat. So I can ask the question of, what percentage of calories in this hot dog are from fat. So I would just take my 117 calories from fat divided by total calories in a serving and multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. And I end up with about 84% of the calories in this hot dog are from fat. I could go then further and I can calculate how many of those calories are from saturated fats too. I also wanted to look at the label here. It's very hard to read, but you can see, there is some meat in here, so I can see where the fat as well as protein is coming from. You can see salt, and then you can see corn syrup, dextrose, hydrogenated soy and potato protein. So there's that hydrogenated word. That says hydrolyzed. I can't see good. I wanted to just point out on here that there's sugar added too. And so again, when we look at carbohydrates, we have to think about what is the source of those. There's not much carbohydrates in here, but in any event, 84% of the calories are from fat. So again, pay attention to nutrition labels so that you can see this hidden fat. It's the sneaky fat. And again, it's mainly processed foods that you are going to find hidden fat in. Okay. So functions of triglycerides. So first of all, fats are essential. Okay, so sometimes when we hear the term fat, it's got like a negative connotation to it. And I need you to understand that fat is it's a macronutrient, right? It should be a significant portion of your daily calories. And so we need fat. So why? What do they do for us? So triglycerides, right? We're talking about those still. Triglycerides are going to provide energy. And we just saw on the previous slide, we did a calculation. We know that fats provide 9 calories per gram. So they're very energy dense, right? That's more than 2 times the amount of energy provided for by carbohydrates or proteins. They're both at 4. Okay, so again, they're energy dense. Our bodies use them as a fuel source. They are the main long-term energy storage source in our body. It's how we store energy. Okay. Again, all of our body cells, can use fat as energy. And I have here, except for the central nervous system and red blood cells, during fasting, though, when ketone bodies are produced, our brain will actually use those as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester in more detail. So again, it is a fuel source. When do we use this as a fuel source? Between meals, when we're fasting, during ketosis, so when we're on a low carb diet, when at rest or during light activity, so 30 to 70% of our energy is supplied by fats, by triglycerides, during rest and during light activity. Okay, during aerobic exercise, especially after blood glucose levels go down and after we've used all of our glycogen stores. Remember, when glycogen is totally used up, we'll start to do glyconeogenesis, which is where we start to break down proteins, but our bodies will use fat to kind of slow that process, to save muscles and things like that, so we don't start to break down proteins. So fat is used as a fuel source. I mentioned this before, but just to make sure we got it. So not only is it used as a fuel, but it's also stored. It's an energy storage. It's the main way that our bodies store energy. There are specific cells called adipose cells, and here's a picture of an adipose cell here. And adipose cells collectively form adipose tissue. Okay, and if you look at an adipose cell under a microscope, they're really neat looking. What happens is their nucleus, which is shown here in blue, it gets pushed to like the outer edge of the cell, and the whole internal cytoplasm is just chock full of lipids. This is a big lipid droplet. These are newly imported triglycerides making their way into these adipose cells. And so, after we eat, what will happen is these structures called chylomicrons, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. They're going to leave the small intestine, which is where fat is absorbed, and they're going to deliver triglycerides to our adipose cells. Okay. So anytime you have excess fat, right, in your diet that your cells aren't using, that excess fat gets stored as triglycerides in our adipose cells. Also, anytime you have excess of any other macronutrient. So if you're having excess carbs, excess protein, excess alcohol, those are all going to get converted to triglycerides. Okay, and they end up getting stored in adipose cells. Okay, insulin triggers fat storage. Okay, just as it does trigger glucose to be taken up by cells. The opposing hormone, which is glucagon, as well as some others, so epinephrine and cortisol, they're going to do the opposite. They're going to activate what's called hormone sensitive lipase. It's in adipose tissue. It's a hormone that's going to break down fat. Okay, so insulin triggers storage, glucagon triggers breakdown. Okay, so we know that we need fat for energy. Fat gets stored as a source for energy. What else? So the second function of triglycerides is insulation and protection of the body. Okay, so we all have some level of subcutaneous fat. That's fat that's found just below the skin. And that subcutaneous fat acts as insulation. Okay, it helps us to keep our body temperature at homeostasis, at a constant level. Okay, it also, we store energy in there as well, and it also serves as a cushion. Okay, if it's in excess, that leads to obesity, right? And obesity has all of those other confounding problems. Visceral fat, on the other hand, it's more dangerous than subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous fat, again, is found just below the skin, where visceral fat is found internally surrounding organs. Okay. Now, some visceral fat is necessary. So there should be a little bit of fat around your organs, especially the organs that move, like your heart rate is pumping blood and it's in a chamber and you don't want it to be rubbing against other things. So a little bit of visceral fat is necessary to provide cushioning to organs, and again, to prevent them from rubbing up against other things and causing injury. However, excessive visceral fat is not a good thing. So excessive visceral fat is going to be a hallmark of cardiovascular disease. We see excessive visceral fat linked with type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, some forms of cancer. So again, an excessive amount of subcutaneous fat's not great, and an excessive amount of visceral fat is really not great. Okay, but some is necessary. Okay, so we've got lipids that are used for energy. We've got lipids that are used for insulation and protection of the body. And we've got fats are going to be really important for absorption and transport of fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so this includes vitamins A, D, E, and K. We're going to spend a whole chapter talking about fat-soluble vitamins. These vitamins are soluble in fat, and in order for them to make their way through our digestive system and get absorbed and make their way to our cells, there has to be fat in your diet. Okay, fats found in our food will carry these vitamins, again, to the small intestines, and in the small intestines, they will get absorbed with dietary fat. They then get transported with dietary fat, with triglycerides, to the cells of our body, again, through these little transport structures called chylomicrons, which we will talk about in a little bit. Okay, Fats play a major role in satiety. So in feeling full and feeling satisfied with food. Okay. Why is that? Well, number one, fat stays in the stomach longer. So it takes longer to break down than carbohydrates. And therefore it slows down digestion, keeping you feeling fuller longer. Dietary fat also triggers the release of a couple of different satiety hormones. One is GLP-1, which you've probably heard of. GLP stands for glucagon-like peptide. And again, there's a few different satiety hormones that get released. This is not the only one. The job of these satiety hormones is pretty much to tell your brain, I've had enough food. Okay, so they cut off that feeling of hunger. Again, fats are more energy dense, 9 calories per gram, kilocalories per gram if we're being technical. And again, lastly, fats provide flavor and texture. They are more satisfying because of that addition of flavor and texture. Okay. All right. Back to fatty acids. Again, we've talked about these a little bit already. So we're talking about omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids. We talked about how both are important structural components of cell membranes. They add in the fluidity. They add to the fluidity and flexibility of the membrane, enhance transport across membranes. So they're really important to every single cell in our body. Omega-3s also are important in the development of the nervous system and retinal development. They're also involved in regulation of nerve transmission and communication between nerve tissue. And then both omega-3 and omega-6, we already mentioned this, are going to be precursors to eicosanoids. And again, those eicosanoids, like we mentioned before, are involved in regulating blood pressure, blood clotting. They're involved in the inflammatory response of the immune system. They're involved in sleep-wake cycles, body temperature. So again, extremely important compounds within the body. So, we need omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. We need them in the right ratio, and we don't need to overconsume them. Okay, so we're going to switch gears for just a couple minutes, and we're going to talk about phospholipids, and then we'll talk about sterols. So these are the other types of lipids. So, everything up until this point has been about triglycerides. And so again, we're going to kind of switch gears and briefly talk about phospholipids, and then talk about cholesterol, which we'll briefly talk about and then kind of come back to it. Okay, so we've mentioned the cell membrane a few times now, and so phospholipids are going to be the major component of cell membranes. They are critical. They make up about, probably over, well, with proteins, I don't know, they make up a major portion of cell membranes. They're the major component. What are they made of? So just like triglycerides, they're made up of glycerol, and then they have 2 fatty acids instead of 3. And then in place of that last fatty acid, they have a phosphate group, which again adds partial charge to the molecule. These can be manufactured in our bodies, so they're not required in our diet like essential fatty acids are. They can be supplied through the diet. There are these things called lectins, and we get those from egg yolks, wheat germ, and peanuts are a couple of different sources of that. But again, our bodies can make them. They are amphipathic molecules. So I mentioned this. What does that mean? So they have 2 distinct regions. They have the fatty acid chains, which those are very hydrophobic, water-fearing, insoluble. We would use all those terms. And then that phosphate group, though, gives it something different that we don't see in triglycerides. The phosphate group has charge. It has a negative charge. And so it has polarity. Because of that negative charge, it will associate with water. Okay, so it has these 2 distinct regions. One is going to repel water, and the phosphate group is going to associate with water. Okay, so again, amphipathic, 2 chemically distinct, and regions that behave very differently. Again, they are critical components of cell membranes, and they also serve as emulsifiers. So phospholipids are also found in bile. Remember, we talked about bile a little bit. We'll talk about it again here. But bile is going to be produced by the liver, stored and concentrated in the gallbladder if you have one, and then through the common bile duct, bile gets delivered to that first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And it's inside of that structure where bile is going to do its job. Bile serves as an emulsifier. So what does that mean? It's going to break down fat molecules, and it's going to put those fat molecules into these structures called micelles, and that's where the phospholipids come into play. We'll talk about micelles in a little bit later in the chapter. Okay, so they're essential for digestion. They're found in bile, and they participate in this emulsification of fat. They're also important for the transport of fat. And so transport is going to happen through lipoproteins. So these things called chylomicrons and very low density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins and high density lipoproteins. They're all this big category of lipoproteins, and lipoproteins, the shell, is going to be composed of phospholipids. Okay, so they're extremely important there. Let's take a peek at what these look like. Okay, so here's the structure. Again, there's that glycerol backbone. We've seen that. And there's two fatty acids. Great. And these fatty acids can be saturated, they can be unsaturated, they can be polyunsaturated, they vary. And then here is the phosphate head group, which again gives this molecule polarity, which means it's going to associate with water. And so if I were to look at a cell, if this is the inside of the cell out here, and this is the outside of the cell out here, so I kind of drew I cut like a cross section right through that cell. If I'm looking at the plasma membrane, this is the outermost structure on animal cells at least. Other cells have another structure outside of it. We are going to find what's called a phospholipid bilayer. This is the plasma membrane. So if we look at these phospholipids, it's a bilayer because there's one layer here and then one layer here. And notice how they're oriented. The fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic and soluble in water-fearing, they're facing each other in the core of that membrane, where the phosphate, we call them head groups, right? The hydrophilic, water-loving, charged region of the molecule is facing outwards towards the watery environment outside or towards the watery environment in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, so these are, again, essential components of the plasma membrane. Oh, I knew I had those labels. So here we go. So again, we have an amphipathic molecule, fatty acid portion, nonpolar, hates water, hydrophobic, water-fearing. The phosphate region is polar, hydrophilic, water-loving. And again, because of this nature of the molecule, they will form a bilayer in membranes. Okay, so every single one of your cells is surrounded by this structure. It's extremely important for cell transport, for cell shape integrity. So again, phospholipids are critical components. Okay, won't say anything more about phospholipids. We'll revisit them again when we talk about transport in a little bit of a later part of the chapter. Let's just switch gears quickly. This is the last slide of this part, by the way, and it's part 5 of the chapter, cholesterol. So again, I just want to quickly mention this. So sterols, this is our last, functional category or type of lipid. And again, the main sterol that we will talk about is cholesterol. So cholesterol is going to be a lipid, right? So it's insoluble in water. It's going to contain multiple rings. We're talking about cholesterol, 4 rings of carbon. Cholesterol is made inside of our body. It's made in our liver. And so it's not an essential part of our diet. We don't need to eat it. Our bodies can make it. However, most people get about 1/3 of their cholesterol from their diet. And so dietary cholesterol will be used by your bodies. What types of food have cholesterol in them? Foods of animal origin, so meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and dairy. And cholesterol can be found in other foods as well. It is an essential component of cell membrane. So we just looked at the cell membrane in the last slide. Cholesterol is also in cell membranes. And again, it's going to aid in fluidity of that membrane. It's going to make sure that the membrane doesn't become too rigid. Okay. Cholesterol is also used to synthesize sex hormones, so estrogen, androgen, and progesterone, adrenal hormones. Cholesterol is also going to be used to synthesize bile, which again, bile is produced by the liver. It does its job in the small intestines. It's required to emulsify or break down fats so that they can then be digested by enzymes. And then cholesterol is also part of the vitamin D synthesis pathway. Okay. The evidence on cholesterol, it's a little bit nuanced. If you look in the last set of dietary guidelines, the U.S. dietary guidelines, so the ones that we talked about, I don't know, back in chapter 2, I think, they were the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. There's not a numeric limit. There used to be. So in previous guidelines, I want to say it was like under 300 milligrams per day. And then I believe it went down to under 200 milligrams per day. But again, in the last set of guidelines, there's not a numeric limit. It does state that a healthy dietary pattern that's low in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, and cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. But they also recommend eating as little dietary cholesterol as possible. So again, it's nuanced. It's a little bit confusing. Research over the years has kind of shifted. And the most current research shows that dietary cholesterol doesn't have as great of an effect on blood cholesterol levels as we used to think it does. And that it's really fat composition and diet. So saturated fats are really the primary drivers of bad cholesterol. So again, nuanced, a little bit confusing. In general, the last guidelines are saying that this is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption, but at the same time, they want you to eat, as low levels as possible. So again, not real clear guidance. So again, the evidence really suggests that it's saturated fats that are the problem with cholesterol levels. So I will leave you with that. In the next section, we will talk about recommended dietary fat intakes. And again, we'll talk about cholesterol again. Okay, so that's it for this part of the chapter.